There are the obvious goals for Israel's campaign in Gaza and the unstated goals. The obvious goals are actually have changed in the last week, because what is obvious today, stopping the tunnels along with the rockets, was not obvious a week ago. And so the most obvious goals at this moment are to limit as much as possible Hamas's capacity in this round, because everyone in Israel knows that there will be another round. The less obvious goal is to ensure some level of Israeli deterrence, because what has happened really since the first Gulf War is that the unthinkable has now become, in some sense, routine. The unthinkable was once that the Israeli home front would be hit with relative impunity, and that Israel would not be able to stop rockets falling on Ashkelon, Tel Aviv, and now as north as Nahariya. And that really was once unthinkable. There was always a very clear demarcation line between the home front and the battleground, even though geographically, of course, there's virtually no distance at all. But in previous wars, up until the first Gulf War, the notion that Israel would be hit, that Israeli cities would be hit on a regular basis was actually unthinkable. What was unthinkable really became routine beginning in the year 2000 with the Second Intifada, and then the Second Lebanon War, which was aimed at Israeli cities in the north, missile attacks, and of course ongoing missile attacks from Gaza. So when Israelis look at this particular conflict, we don't see only Israel versus Hamas. There's a pattern that's been formed, especially since the year 2000, and that pattern is that the home front is now the main target for Israel's adversaries. And the main target, again, to just emphasize that, is no longer the Israeli military. Bases are not being attacked by Hamas, just as army bases were not attacked by Hezbollah in 2006. It is the Israeli civilian population that is the primary target, and the purpose, of course, is to demoralize and terrorize. Hamas knows it can't destroy Israel in any one round, but the psychological effect of these attacks is to convince the Israeli public that we have no real long-term future in the Middle East, and that the government cannot really protect its people. Now, I remember in 2005, when Israel, just before Israel withdrew from Gaza, in the unilateral withdrawal, which I personally supported enthusiastically, and I have no regrets to this day that we are not still occupying Gaza. I have regrets in some of the ways in which we managed the withdrawal, but the fact that we pulled out, I think, was a blessing for Israel. But I remember having a conversation at the time with a friend of mine, a man on the left who was one of the leading figures in promoting the unilateral withdrawal. And I said, you know, I agree with you. We need to get out of there. But the right is making a credible argument. When the right is warning that when we get out of Gaza, the rockets are not going to fall anymore on the settlements inside Gaza. The rockets will now move over the border, and that's a pretty likely scenario. And this friend of mine just laughed disparagingly, and he said, how like the right to just terrorize us with fears. And he said, can you imagine anyone firing rockets on Ashkelon or Ashdod, and the Israeli army not pulverizing Gaza and ending the threat within 2 hours? Inconceivable. This is how most people on the left were talking 10 years ago. And so, again, the inconceivable becomes not just conceivable, but routine. And so the unstated goal of this operation, and I wouldn't yet call it a war, we're still in the realm of an expanded military operation, although it is getting closer to being a war. The unstated goal is to ensure Israel's deterrence in a region that is spiraling out of control. If Israel's neighbors get used to the notion that our population centers can be hit with relative impunity and Israel can't stop it, then we really are in a new phase of our security dilemmas. Now, every one of Israel's wars or military conflicts since Yom Kippur 1973 has ended with a commission of inquiry forced upon the government to investigate the failures of that war. That happened after the Yom Kippur War, when we had the Agranat Commission. After Lebanon won in 1982, we had the Khan Commission to investigate the Sabra and Shatila massacres. After Lebanon II, we had the Winograd Commission. My prediction is that the next commission of inquiry is already on its way. And I would like to propose or predict the topic for the next government commission of inquiry to examine the army's and the political echelon's failures, and that is going to focus on the tunnels. Why is it that we had no idea of the extent of the tunnels, and that we had no idea that when the government was warning us about the threats facing the Israeli civilian population, it focused on the rockets? Now, we now know that over these last years, when Hamas leaders would continuously say that we have surprises up our sleeve, they didn't only mean rockets that can hit Haifa from Gaza. They actually meant the tunnels. And we came upon this threat last week, you will recall, by accident, because an Israeli military patrol intercepted 16 Hamas men who were on their way to take over a border kibbutz, which would have ended either in a hostage situation or a massacre. And that was the moment that I would say was the turning point for the Israeli public in this war. Until that moment, the public very much saw this in terms of a limited operation. We need to prevent Hamas from firing rockets on the Israeli public. Today, the perception among the majority of Israelis has shifted, and if there needs to be a longer-term campaign, I think that the public is ready for that. And this really is almost a strategic shift in the thinking of the Israeli public. But again, when this ends, when this round of fighting ends, there will be a reckoning, and the public will demand to know, why wasn't the military prepared in terms of the tunnels? Why didn't the government prepare the public for this turn? The Israeli public has demonstrated so far an impressive degree of cohesion. Those of you who know Israel know that we don't agree on almost anything. Israelis are not shy about criticizing their government. This prime minister, I would say, is the paradox of this prime minister, is that on the one hand, he is one of the least beloved prime ministers that we've ever had. Even people who vote for Netanyahu don't like him. But he is now Israel's second longest serving prime minister, and on his way perhaps to being the longest serving prime minister. Partly that is because of default, but it also is because the public, by and large, trusts Netanyahu's sobriety. Now, I recognize there's a disconnect here in terms of how much of the international community perceives Netanyahu as reckless and a child murderer, and the way that most Israelis, including people on the left in Israel, including columnists like Nahum Barnea, Israel's most important columnist, who is very much a man on the left and despises Netanyahu. He wrote a column the other day lauding Netanyahu's restraint. Now, part of the disconnect that we have in terms of the Israeli public, and again, this ranges from left to center to right. I'm excluding far left, which is a very, very small minority of the Israeli public. But mainstream left rightward today views Netanyahu as acting with tremendous restraint. The fact that he waited for a full week while Israel was absorbing rocket attacks before retaliating, the fact that he accepted the Egyptian ceasefire and Hamas rejected it, the fact that he has pushed back the far right in Israel, including the far right within his own government, people like Naftali Bennett, who are urging an all-out invasion and for Israel to use its massive military power to put an immediate end to the rockets, which Israel could do in 2 hours if that was the decision. For all those reasons, Netanyahu has won an impressive virtual wall-to-wall consensus, which again almost never happens in Israel, especially at a time when so much of the international community is condemning Israel for its supposedly reckless aggression. And the very fact that people like Tzipi Livni and head of the labor opposition, Bougie Herzog, are supporting the government, that's where you need to look within the political system to see what the tone, what the mood is in the Israeli public. Because so long as the left-wing parties, the mainstream left-wing parties, remain within this broad pro-government coalition, that is a reflection of the fact that the country has made a decision, the population has made a decision that we will support the government and the army step by step, even as the war or the conflict escalates. One last word about Netanyahu, which I think is not properly understood abroad. In the Israel of today, the Israel that since the year 2000 has gone from one terror conflict to the next, the real opposition to Netanyahu is not the left. The left today has virtually no chance of coming back to power anytime in the foreseeable future. Netanyahu is not holding the line against the left. He's holding the line against the farther right. And that is why many Israelis, again, who don't necessarily like him, appreciate the fact, however grudgingly, that it's Netanyahu in power, because the alternative to Netanyahu is not Bougie Herzog or Tzipi Livni, but more likely Lieberman, our foreign minister, and perhaps eventually even Naftali Bennett. You had mentioned, Colin, the phrase "ein breira," which is a Hebrew term that was very popular in Israel in the early years of the state, and it means no alternative. That Israel has no alternative but to bite its lip and to accept the fact that it has to fight an enemy that whose goal is the destruction of Israel. Now, that was the sensibility of the Israeli public up until the Oslo process in the early 90s. Oslo opened, or I would even say perhaps up until the Sadat visit to Israel in 1977. That was the first time that opened the possibility that maybe there are factors, forces within the Arab world that are ready to offer us an alternative. And so, ein breira, this notion of there's no alternative to Israel's siege mentality, began to crack already then. And then with the Oslo process, it cracked even further, and we saw a major split in Israeli society in the 90s between left and right. That split, which really defined Israeli politics through the 80s and I say especially the 1990s, ended more or less in the year 2000 with the collapse of the Oslo process. And I know we're doing some history here, but the history is important to understand the current state of mind in Israel. To think about Israel today, Israeli politics, as being more or less evenly divided as we were in the 80s and 90s, between two implacable ideological camps, one on the left and one on the right, is to not understand the Israeli polity today. The majority of the Israeli public today is neither left nor right, but a combination of both, which is another way of saying that most Israelis today are center. Center in the sense of very hawkish on security and willing at the same time, in principle, to make virtually any territorial concession if the public is convinced that that would end the conflict. And that's a big if. In principle, a majority of Israelis today are ready to redivide Jerusalem, for example, if they believed that that is the game changer. You redivide Jerusalem and peace comes, a majority of Israelis, according to polls over the last 15 years, are ready to make that deal. The other half of that, though, the other half of understanding the Israeli public, is that the same majority, which in principle is ready to make almost any concession that will end this conflict, in practice believes that no amount of Israeli concessions at this point will actually bring peace. That is the new Israeli center. Another way of understanding the center is that on a Palestinian state, a majority of Israelis believe that a Palestinian state is an existential necessity for Israel. It would save Israel from making the impossible choice between being a Jewish state and a democratic state. It will ease Israel's growing pariah status around the world. It will spare Israel the growing moral burden of passing on the occupation of another people from one generation, from father to son. I fought in Gaza during the first Intifada. My son has now fought in Gaza in the 2009 war, and Gaza is the nightmare of Israeli society. At the same time, most of us who call ourselves centrist believe that a Palestinian state that would be formed under the wrong conditions, and today these are definitely the wrong conditions, with Hamas in power in Gaza, a Palestinian state under current conditions would be an existential threat to Israel. We would risk turning Greater Tel Aviv into, God forbid, into Sderot. Sderot is the little town, the Israeli town that borders Gaza, which is on the receiving end of thousands of rockets over the last decade. If we were to create a Palestinian state in the West Bank, the likelihood, and most Israelis are convinced of this, the likelihood would be that these same primitive rockets, and not so primitive as we've seen in this round of fighting, would be falling mostly not along the borders of Gaza, but would be falling on the heartland of Israel. Another way of understanding the deep ambivalence of the Israeli center toward a Palestinian state is that most of us in the center regard a Palestinian state in one of two ways. On the one hand, I would say that we have two nightmares about a Palestinian state. The first nightmare is that there won't be a Palestinian state, and the status quo will continue indefinitely, and Israel's position internationally will just get worse and worse. And the second nightmare is that there will be a Palestinian state, and Israel will find itself unable to effectively defend its heartland. These are the two nightmares that the Israeli center carry. Now, a few words about the ethics of this war and the ethics of our conflict with the Palestinians generally. the Israeli public, by and large, accepts the argument of the IDF that it is waging, under the circumstances, a morally credible operation, despite the high number of civilian casualties. For the reasons that I think we know, the IDF and the Israeli government has made its positions clear, that the primary responsibility lies with Hamas and that Israel has no choice when you're facing an enemy. We experienced this with Hezbollah in 2006, when you are confronting an enemy whose goal is to kill as many civilians as possible, not only on the Israeli side, and this is the terrible dilemma that Israel faces, it is in Hamas's interest that there be high casualty rates on the Palestinian side as well. That is the single greatest achievement, in heavy quotation marks, that Hamas can deliver, because that's what activates world opinion, that's what puts pressure on Israel. If for no other reason than the simply pragmatic military reason, the worst thing for Israel is high civilian casualties, not on the Israeli side, on the Palestinian side. Israel did not want to go into Gaza in the worst possible way for a very simple reason. Because what is happening now, we all knew would happen. We all understood that if we go back into Gaza, there will be terrible incidents, terrible tragedies were going to happen, and Israel's position internationally was going to worsen. Hamas's position internationally would improve. And so Israel desperately tried not to go in. The question then is, did Israel have an alternative? I think the answer that most Israelis would give you is there is no credible military alternative than sending in the ground forces. First we tried not to respond. That was the first phase. Let's give the international community time to pressure Hamas. That was the first week. Then came the air war, and then we tried not to send in ground forces. As soon as you send in ground forces, two things happen. Soldiers start coming back in body bags. And in Israel, fallen soldiers are not martyrs. We don't turn fallen soldiers into martyrs. We don't have a military culture of martyrdom. When soldiers fall, they revert to becoming our children. And that is the way the Israeli media relate. Every fallen soldier is the son of someone, and we all know their stories. And we all go through this experience of knowing that it could be any one of our sons in their place. And so that is where we are now. We are in the third phase of this operation. Now, having said that, I think that is the position that we need to take, certainly in terms of Israel's critics internationally. And Colin, I think the point you raised needs to be said very clearly to the hypocrites who are silent about Syria and Iraq, etc., and are watching the death count on the Palestinian side like it's a ticker tape. And the casualties in Gaza, as tragic as those casualties are one day's casualties in Syria and Iraq. And that's a position that we need to make. But that's not the only position that Israel and the Jewish community needs to take. I would propose a two-track Jewish conversation or approach. The first is the position that I just spelled out, and that is our conversation with the international community. Don't put us on a higher pedestal than our enemies, only to knock us down. We will not stand on that position. We will not tolerate the criminalization of Israel, certainly not in the Middle East, not in the region where we are. The second track of our conversation needs to be internal, an internal Israeli and diaspora Jewish conversation. And there we need to ask ourselves hard moral questions. And those questions are we really doing everything we can to minimize the number of civilian casualties in Gaza? Do we really, for example, need a policy of bombing the houses of Hamas leaders? That's where a heavy number of civilian casualties take place. Yes, we warn before that, but we also know that many civilians don't leave or go back to the house. Is that an essential part? I understand the psychological dimension of bombing the houses of people, of Hamas leaders who are destroying our houses in civilian Israel. I get it. We need to ask ourselves tougher questions. What very often happens in internal Jewish conversation, in our own conversation of the Jewish left and the Jewish right, is that we tend to confuse these two conversations. So in our internal Jewish conversations, we'll often hear Jewish voices on the right trying to suppress an internal Jewish debate over the ethics of how we wage war, by saying, look at what's happening in Syria. When I'm having an internal Jewish conversation, I don't want to hear about Syria. I'm interested in looking at myself. The Jewish left, by contrast, takes our anguish in our own internal conversations, often, into international arenas that are not worthy of Jewish soul-searching. Those arenas that are not friends of the Jewish people and do not mean us well. So we need a little bit of wisdom and nuance in our conversation. We need less left-wing soul-searching internationally and more Jewish soul-searching in our own internal conversation. That's something that I'm just putting out for the Jewish community here. I'll go on for another 5 minutes, and then there are no quick fixes here. No quick fixes. There are no quick military fixes. You can't send commando units in like Entebbe and end the threat of tunnels and rockets. They're toppling Hamas, however tempting that is, and we can do it. We can do it in 24 hours. We can do it in less time. Then the question is, what happens next? Do we reoccupy Gaza? Do we rebuild settlements in Gaza? There is no realistic alternative. There's no good alternative. On the other hand, when we hear Obama saying we need to resume the peace process, most Israelis look at that as another well-intentioned but delusional quick fix. Let me say a word about why the peace process failed the first time in these last 9 months. I would attribute 3 reasons, one on the Israeli side, one on the Palestinian side, and one objectively. On the Palestinian side, the main reason why we cannot reach an agreement today is the same reason why we couldn't reach an agreement in the year 2000, why Abbas walked away in 2008 from Olmert's offer, because of right of return. The Palestinian demand for refugee return, not to a future state of Palestine, but to the state of Israel, is a deal breaker for any Israeli government, left, right, or center. The premise of a two-state solution is that you will have 2 states, each of which is responsible for gathering into its territory any part of its diaspora that wants to come home. Just as once there is a Palestinian state, Jews coming from the diaspora will not be able to settle in those areas which will be sovereign Palestine. Palestinian descendants of Palestinian refugees will not be able to settle in that part of the territories of what the Palestinians consider all of Palestine, that is the state of Israel. That's the deal. One right of return for another right of return. At this moment, no Palestinian leadership, including Abbas, though he has on occasion made some very positive statements which he immediately retracted, because of criticism within Palestinian society. There is no Palestinian leadership today willing or able to make that crucial concession, which is the only concession that will convince a majority of the Israeli public that it is safe to trust the Palestinians and have a two-state solution. On our side, the deal breaker at this point is Jerusalem. Now, I said earlier that a majority of the Israeli public is willing in principle to make a two-state solution that would include redividing Jerusalem, and I believe that that remains true. In practice, today, with Hamas in power in Gaza and threatening to take over a future state in the West Bank, a majority of Israelis will not risk the nightmare possibility of waking up one morning and finding out that Hamas is sitting in East Jerusalem. That is inconceivable. And I can tell you, as a citizen of Jerusalem, I'll say two things. I'm ready, in principle, as painful as it is, to redivide my city, if I think that really is the end of the conflict. In practice, as a citizen of Jerusalem, with responsibility, a custodian for Jerusalem, with responsibility for the future of that city, there is no way that I will support redividing Jerusalem if it risks the possibility of Hamas taking over. So that means that we cannot reach an end of conflict arrangement anytime soon. And the third reason, which is objective circumstances, is the not insignificant fact, which the diplomats always seem to ignore, and that is that the Middle East is disintegrating. There are whole countries on our borders that are no longer actual countries. Syria doesn't exist anymore. Iraq, for all practical purposes, doesn't exist in the way we once conceived of Iraq. I'm not sure we can really speak of a Lebanon anymore. Libya, a little farther afield. Countries are disintegrating. In that atmosphere, neither the Palestinian leadership nor the Israeli leadership will make the far-ranging concessions, will take those risks that are needed to create a two-state solution. There is no possibility, and we need to internalize this, anytime in the near future, and I'm emphasizing the near future, because as far as the middle or long-term future, as we say in the Middle East, God is great. Nobody knows. There is always a chance of some strange turn of events, and many of us, most of us here, I think, are old enough to remember Anwar Sadat getting off a plane in Tel Aviv and finding Menachem Begin greeting him. And that is also part of the Middle East and what is possible. So I don't preclude anything, even good news, in the Middle East eventually, but for the foreseeable future, no chance. And so the question then is, what do we do? How do we navigate in the short term? And I'll just make a few very brief comments, and then we'll open for questions and comments. First, I believe, is on Israel's side, we need to stop expanding in settlements. I'm not including Jerusalem because any government, left, right, or center, would continue building in Jewish areas in Jerusalem. We need to stop expanding in settlements, not because that is what is preventing a peace agreement today. It is not. Israel can have a total settlement freeze, as we had 4 years ago, for 9 months, and the Palestinian leadership didn't even show up at the table. So it has nothing to do with why there is no peace today. But we need to not complicate the chances of an eventual agreement 5 years or 10 years from now. And that means Israeli restraint. It also means that the international community needs to have the wisdom to draw a distinction between peace and settlements. So when Kerry says that the peace process failed because Israel announced that it was building 400 apartments in the Jerusalem neighborhood of Gilo, no one in Israel, and I mean no one, took that seriously. Whether that was true internationally is a different matter. And the final point here is, let's not lose track of what is really significant here. And that goes for Israel, it goes for the Jewish community and the international community. And that is, ultimately, it's not about Gaza. The real countdown that is happening in the Middle East today is Iran. And my worry about this conflict in Gaza, and I know this is Netanyahu's worry, is that it will absorb all of Israel's energies. It will absorb the energies of the international community. It will detract us from the drama that is happening around the negotiating table in Geneva, where the international community appears set to create the conditions in which Iran closes in on the finishing line, and if not this year, in 2 years, in 4 years, is allowed, God forbid, to become the next North Korea. That's what we need to keep our primary